Yeah, we are poor because they are rich. I really like this slogan, but I think it needs some explaining. It needs a bit more emphasis on why this is. And that's kind of my hope for today. And I think, honestly, it's because life for the average person today, it feels like this absurd comedy, where everybody else is in on the bit except for you. The moment you leave your house, sometimes before that even happens, tens, sometimes hundreds of hands appear out of nowhere, and they're demanding your money for rent, for groceries, for your cell phone and internet, for tips, for bullshit fees, and car insurance. We work all week and then are forced to divvy up our measly paychecks into these mysterious hands, and we watch it disappear into the ether. And each month, each year, it gets harder just to keep our heads above water. And according to a new H&R Block survey, 85% of Canadians feel that living paycheck to paycheck is the new norm. Another 51% say it's hard to make ends meet. And in Edmonton, the average cost of living for a single person is about $2,900 per month all in. At minimum wage, you'd be short $700 a month, unless you got roommates or a second job. And part of this is because the cost of basic necessities has skyrocketed. You don't really need me to tell you this. And this is felt most heavily by ordinary people like us, the students and the workers. In the last 5 years, groceries have gotten 30% more expensive and are expected to rise another 5% this year. Buying a home has become a total pipe dream, so we're confined to rent at extortionate prices. It's becoming impossible not to feel the squeeze. For those fortunate enough to have a job, we are barely scraping by. And even worse, more and more people are facing unemployment. Just last month, it was announced that 6.9% of people in Canada are unemployed. And among students, this rises to 20%, nearly 1 in 5 people, which is actually the worst in decades. And you hear stories about Canadian youth applying to hundreds, sometimes thousands of jobs and are still unsuccessful. Often that's because you get an AI to write your job application, and then you submit that to an AI who reads your job application, and I guess all this is to say that AI doesn't want to hire itself. Even worse, 1/5 of people are skipping meals, while more than 2 million people per month, more than ever before, are relying on food banks. About 10% of Canadians live below the poverty line, while tent cities and homelessness have become a core feature of every city across the country. The future looks bleak, and the present is dreadful. And so I think facing all of this, it's obvious that something has gone wrong. Millions of ordinary people are struggling and suffering just to survive. Meanwhile, the rich live in lavish luxury. There are so many stories about people like Bezos spending unfathomable amounts of money on ridiculous bullshit like yachts and stuff. First, there was the infamous all-female space flight, where for 10 minutes, millionaire and billionaire women, including noted astrophysicist Katy Perry, went on a casual space jaunt. And while the exact cost wasn't made public, space tourism, even for suborbital flights, where they don't actually break out of the atmosphere, like Dr. Perry's, cost tens of millions of dollars. And even worse, those 10 minutes in space made more pollution than the poorest 1 billion people will in their entire lifetimes. And not content with demonstrating that the billionaires love burning money just for the fuck of it, Bezos then rented out Venice for 3 days for his wedding in June. It's estimated that the wedding cost $60 million. That's actually the equivalent of 37 Amazon warehouse workers' lifetime wages. But this is just a drop in the bucket of Bezos' multi-trillion-dollar empire. And really what we're seeing is that these billionaires are concentrating an enormous amount of wealth in their hands. The richest 1% made $42 million an hour last year. How much did you guys make? I see a lot of zeros, ones. I don't know how you made $1 an hour. Even worse, 4 new billionaires were being minted per week across the world. In Canada alone, billionaire wealth increased by $309 million per day. Actually, the money held by Canadian billionaires could carpet Vancouver in $50 bills. This is the kind of money that they have. For Canadian workers, real wages, which is just the money you make minus inflation at the same time, we're only making about $40 more than we were 10 years ago. That's nothing. That barely gets you dinner these days. And since the 1980s, real wages have only grown 20%. That's $200 per week for the average worker over nearly 60 years. For the billionaires, however, things are a little bit nicer. In the last 40 years, their wealth increased by 20,000%, from 83 billion in 1987, when Forbes first started tracking billionaires, to a whopping $16.1 trillion this year. I had a hard time trying to figure out how to show everybody this amount of wealth. I found that there's this website where you can scroll, and actually, if you just let your computer scroll, it will take an hour to get through all of the billionaires' wealth, if $1 million is 1 pixel. But the actual closest number I found was $16 trillion is about the same amount of dollars as a child has cells. I don't know what to say beyond that. The rich keep getting richer, and this gap is growing wider. But like I said at the beginning, the point of today isn't just to tell you how bad this system is. That we are poor because they are rich is indisputable. Everybody knows that the system is built to enrich the wealthy and the powerful. There's this deep anger and a real hatred of the status quo. But if we want to convince people of the need to overthrow capitalism, we have to go beyond moral arguments. And really, all of the lies about hard work, taking risks, or creating jobs that we hear are illusions that obscure the realities of the system. We need to explain that capitalism is built on the exploitation of the workers. And more importantly, exploitation and inequality and the things that we see, they're not the result of cheating, force, or might. This inequality is the product of the laws and logic of the capitalist system itself. Once set in motion, this exploitation and inequality become an inevitable tendency, and it cannot be reformed away. And so despite the claims of the ruling class and their apologists here in the universities and their assholes in suits in the government, these laws have not existed for all eternity. Capitalism is just one of several modes of production in the history of human society. Even the division of society into different classes, slave and slave owner, lord and serf, now worker and capitalist, are relatively recent in this vast history of humanity. Before class society, humanity was organized into tribal communities where the means of production, basically the things we require to feed and clothe ourselves and ultimately survive, were held in common. And so I think this poses the question, how did these largely egalitarian societies where wealth was held in common and built on cooperation lead to this vicious cycle of inequality where the capitalists end up at the top? I think for those of us who were bold enough to ask the question to our unsuspecting parents, teachers, or professors, we're often told it's the product of human nature. And this means that some people are intelligent, they're risk takers and go-getters, while the rest are lazy and live beyond their means. And so because of this, the first type of person becomes wealthy, while the second are forced to sell their own skins to survive. And so the working class, we have to accept we're condemned to this lifetime of misery because our ancestors were frivolous and lazy. The poor are to blame for being poor. How many times have we heard that before? But the rise of capitalism and the capitalists was anything but peaceful or natural. It's a well-known fact that conquest, slavery, robbery, and murder played a central role in the establishment of capitalism. And so, I think we have to ask the question, what is capitalism? Capitalism revolves around commodity production, that is, to produce goods and services explicitly to sell them. Commodities existed before capitalism, but under this system, it becomes generalized and it infiltrates into every single aspect of life. But before capitalist relations emerged, things were not made explicitly to be sold. You can imagine a peasant living in feudal society. He might have produced more grain or cloth or tools than he needed himself. And so he could trade these things for other stuff that he didn't have. The key difference being that the peasant produced these things because they were useful to him. For the modern capitalist, they produce these items to sell them so that they can make a profit. Under capitalism, commodity production requires capital, which is really just money that makes more money. It's their factories, the lands, the tools, all of these things that the capitalists own. But not all money or wealth is necessarily capital, right? We've all got money here today, but I don't see any capitalists in the room. At least I hope not. And so what does it actually require? This transformation of money into capital, which is really the basis of capitalist relations, relies on a unique commodity, the commodity of labor power. And this commodity didn't emerge until a class of workers were born. And so therefore, for capitalist relations to take hold, not only is there a need for capitalists, with their wealth accumulated through the conquest and plunder of the colonies, but it also demands turning the former serfs, peasants, and artisans into workers. It needed to strip them of their land and tools and turn them into a class of people who were deprived of everything. Previously, these things had guaranteed their existence for generations, but now they were left with nothing but their ability to work for somebody else. In England, for example, this occurred through the enclosure movement during the 15th and 16th century. And there was this widespread eviction of the peasants and the serfs from the farmlands. And their homesteads were destroyed, burned down, and people who resisted were murdered. And I think the question is why? They were displaced by the landlords in favor of sheep. Sheep. And this is because, at the time, there was an enormous demand for wool with the beginnings of the Industrial Revolution. And this meant it was far more profitable to have sheep occupy these lands than people. And in doing so, the poor common folk were displaced from the villages and forced into the arms of the early capitalists. They happily began exploiting this layer. And they even argued that these workers came to them looking for jobs of their own free will. And so just to give you a bit of an anecdote, Thomas More, a British lord who described this process happening in his famous book, Utopia, some of you might know it. And it illustrated the evils that were running rampant throughout 16th century Britain. And he says, it's a bit long, I apologize, but I think you'll like it. One covetous and insatiable cormorant, which is to mean the landlord, very plague of his native country may enclose many thousands acres of land together. The husbandmen be thrust out of their own, either by cunning and fraud, or by violence and oppression, or by wrongs and injuries, that they may be compelled to sell all, either by hook or crook. They must depart away, poor, silly, wretched souls, men, women, husbands, wives, children, and whole households. This was state-sanctioned robbery and violence against a vast layer of society. It turned formerly self-sufficient farmers into landless, destitute workers who were forced into the cities to get work. There, children as young as 5 or 6 were working the same shifts as adults in the mines and the factories. And the result was generations of working-class children who received little to no education, were paid starvation wages, and given horrible diseases and early deaths in exchange. Why? Because children were cheaper to employ than men and women. Children could also be more easily bullied and beaten into submission by the bosses. For these working class families, sending their children into the workplace was the only way to survive. This is the reality of capitalism's origins, and while the oppression has been concealed since then, it is no less exploitative or real. And I think this is important because today, the capitalist politicians and academics, they have no hesitations about labeling Marxists as these bloodthirsty maniacs because we want revolutionary change in society. And they equate revolution with violence, murder, and anarchy. And yet, in the face of violence necessary to establish capitalism, they retain a stoical peace of mind, to quote Marx. And while accusing us, these apologists of capitalism forget their very own violent past. And so, by the time of the 17th and the 18th century, the capitalist class had become economically dominant across several European countries, but they were hemmed in by the feudal aristocracy and monarchy. Their heavy taxation and unproductive spending on luxuries had become an obstacle to the development of society and production. And this produced the bourgeois revolutions in England during the 1640s and the Great French Revolution of 1789. And here, capitalism begins to carry out its historic role, to do away with the obstacle of feudalism and convert this scattered personal production into capitalist private property and mass production. And since its establishment in Europe, it spread across the globe and became the dominant mode of production on Earth. And like all modes of production, from slave societies to feudalism and capitalism today, they come onto the scene of history as a necessary part of humanity's development, and it allows for this leap in production, developing science, culture, industry, agriculture, and technology, all of these things. But then once established, the laws of capitalist competition act to concentrate and centralize these productive forces in society. It leads to the creation of monopolies and the multinational corporations that we see that dominate every single aspect of our lives. This production for self-consumption is done away with, a strict division of labor is implemented, the economies of each country are brought together in the world market with supply chains that span the entire globe. And all of this is done for the sake of increased efficiency and productivity, which is ultimately to increase profits. And this reinvestment of money back into production as capital is what allowed this system to displace feudalism in the first place. But now this is all being turned on its head as capitalism begins to drag society backwards. And so, I don't know about you guys, but anytime I talk to somebody about communism and the need for revolution, they tell me, but Daniel, capitalism is the system of freedom and choice. But for those of us on Earth, we know that this is a total lie. We have the freedom to be exploited by our choice of bosses, so we can survive. We can choose from a variety of brands at the grocery store, where 80% of our grocery items are controlled by 4 or fewer brands. You can pick a cell phone plan from Bell, Telus, or Rogers, who control 90% of the telecom market in Canada. You could fly to a different country, but the plane you fly on will undoubtedly be a Boeing or an Airbus. Undoubtedly, you hold your money in one of the big 5 banks who control 90% of financial services in Canada. And finally, when you actually do decide to buy something, these transactions are all handled by Visa or MasterCard, who dominate 92% of the $27 trillion payment processing industry. Even in death, the monopolies will happily bury you 6 feet under, where 82% of coffins are made by one of 2 firms. It gets a little morbid, but that's the truth. This is the system we live under. And it's not a new tendency either, because back at the beginning of the 20th century, J.P. Morgan, the Wall Street kingpin, he used every economic crisis to snap up failing banks and businesses, ultimately to centralize power and wealth into his hands. More recently, J.P. Morgan Chase, yes, the same one, bought up several more banks. They got Chase in the meantime. Then they bought Credit Suisse after the collapse of the Silicon Valley Bank a couple of years ago. And now today, J.P. Morgan Chase controls $3.5 trillion in assets around the world. And that sounds like a big number until you compare it to BlackRock, the world's largest investment firm, who controls more than $11 trillion in investments. Capitalism is built on the rich getting richer. And Lenin recognized this tendency of capitalism towards monopolies, and he wrote his famous book, Imperialism, the Highest Stage of Capitalism, right at the same time. Lenin explains that the logic of capitalism made these monopolies inevitable. And this is echoed by a famous saying, I think it's very popular in computer science, that a system does what it is intended to do. And so why should we expect different results when the chase for profit motivates everything? And yes, strictly speaking, I know if anybody took an Econ 101 class this week, you know that in bourgeois economics they call these duopolies or oligopolies. But what difference does it make in reality? The big banks have consolidated so much power and money that they direct investment around the economy. They own controlling shares of many major corporations. Actually, there was a study that showed that these gigantic asset managers, like BlackRock, engage in what the study called horizontal shareholding, which is where they control significant stakes in competing companies within the same industry. Which, said more simply, is that even when there's this illusion of competition within a sector, it is likely that a small group of billionaires and bankers are pulling the strings behind the scenes. Where's the billionaires and bankers behind the scenes there? And so yeah, this is no conspiracy, but an objective fact that is recognized by millions of people. The rich work together to keep themselves at the top. And so yeah, I think sometimes you'll hear again that this isn't capitalism anymore. So are we sure this is still capitalism? We hear all kinds of arguments to defend this system as it is. We're told that small is beautiful, or that this isn't real capitalism anymore. Instead, we live under corporatism, crony capitalism, or a number of other weird and wonderful things. They argue that government intervention and corruption have created what we're witnessing. The truth is, capitalism means big. Big pharma, big oil, big tech, big AI. In sector after sector, thanks to these crises and downturns, the big win out and buy up the small through mergers and acquisitions, and it concentrates the market further. The corruption, the control over the government, and all the other controversies we see are a product of capitalism's laws. This economic power has provided the capitalist class with overwhelming political power. Profit rules the world. And so for these defenders of capitalism, their solution is to try and turn back time, to call for greater competition, for freer markets, or to try and break up the monopolies through antitrust laws and regulations. Or they call for protectionism and economic nationalism, make America great again. in the hope to fight back against these multinational corporations by buying local, buying Canadian, putting our elbows up, and promoting home industry. The truth is, all of these suggestions are completely utopian. Monopolies came into existence because they are more efficient and more productive, meaning profitable. They were the ones that organized production across the globe with this complex web of supply chains. Capitalism developed these connections precisely because they allowed for advancements in production. To try and disband these monopolies is to suggest returning to lower levels of economic development, basically making us poorer. There is no going back from here. Thank you. Second. But under the control of the working class, this immense organization could be used to produce exactly what we need. Companies like Walmart or Amazon, for example, they have this extraordinary amount of planning running behind the scenes to keep things going. And this is to ensure that their warehouses are kept full and shelves are constantly stocked, ready to be shipped anywhere in the world. Actually, the sales are predicted so accurately at Walmart that as you take something off the shelf, that item is already coming from the warehouse to put it back. This is how much knowledge we have of what is needed in society. But left to the capitalists, all this potential is wasted. And on the other hand, it's become very trendy to blame these problems on price gouging and greedflation. And this is basically to say that the corporations increase the price of things to scrape extra money out of people's pockets when hard times hit. And usually this follows from the idea of corporate greed, that these big businesses are earning more than their fair share. And we can look at this recent bread fixing scandal with Loblaws. And literally, the Canadian bosses were working together for at least 14 years to make it harder for us to get bread. No, okay. Really, the gang of Loblaws, Sobeys, Metro, and Walmart were all working together to ensure bread stayed profitable. The price of bread rose by 96% compared to 45% for all other foods. And certainly, these monopolies profit from their position and work together to protect their bread. And it should be no shock that they are looking to screw us over for every single dollar. But according to the laws of capitalist competition, if they raise prices, a competitor should undercut them to take their share. And you actually hear this complaint from small business owners that they just can't pass on all of these extra costs from inflation and fuel and everything else onto their consumers without losing sales. If they do that, their customers will go to the big corporations who benefit from economies of scale and can offer these products more cheaply and actually take that loss if necessary. And what this does is it allows the multinationals and monopolies to make extra profits during times of crisis through price fixing and these backroom deals. But these extra profits ultimately draw other capitalists in and it pushes the price back down to normal. So certainly, greedflation is a real phenomena, but it doesn't really explain anything. In fact, it actually obscures reality, and it suggests that the system could be fixed by convincing the capitalists to be less greedy. The capitalists that have risen to the top, like Walmart, Apple, United Health, and Google, they got there by being more ruthless and cutthroat than the rest. They put bread, profits, above all else. But I think this forces us to ask, where do the profits actually come from under capitalism? And so we know that these capitalists have to sell their commodities to make profits, but that they generally can't sell them for more than they're worth. We buy and sell things that appear equal in value, but if this were true, then no profit would get made. So where is it? It's hiding in this special commodity that only the capitalists can purchase, our labor power, our ability to work. We as the working class sell our lives bit by bit to the capitalists, where we spend our days creating value for them. We are paid back wages, but these wages cannot be equal to the total value we create while we're at work. Otherwise, the capitalists wouldn't profit. And in fact, our wages represent the bare minimum to keep the average worker alive and coming back to work. And the only reason the capitalists can do this is because they own everything. What choice do we have under this system but to go to work each day to try and survive? But it doesn't have to be this way. A new system is clearly necessary, but it's crucial that we understand what we're up against. So this brings me to the ruling class, because under this system, the capitalists control everything about how and when production happens. They own everything, so they control everything. To protect such a system and to prevent the workers from fighting back, the capitalists have built a powerful state apparatus and its institutions all designed to serve their interests. This state is the government, the laws, the army, police, and the justice system. These are the armed bodies of men defending capitalism. And we see this when a worker steps out of line and steals food to feed their family. They can expect fines, or they can go to jail. But if the billionaires steal piles of money through insider trading, fraud, or tax evasion, it usually goes unpunished. It's estimated that between $250 billion up to $1 trillion occurs due to white-collar crimes in the US alone. And at best, sometimes the most egregious crimes are punished, if only to maintain this illusion of equality before the law. And I think it's important to recognize that the state isn't something imposed onto society. It's not something that just came from nowhere. It's a product of class society itself. It's an admission that society, that humans living together have been split into antagonistic classes that have competing economic interests that can't be reconciled. And so for this reason, the ruling class is compelled to have this kind of judge that's supposed to be neutral sitting at the top of society. And the fundamental truth is that every state must serve the interests of one class in society. Under capitalism, it is the capitalist class who rules because of their role in controlling production. And I think the illusion that such a state could be reformed to be kinder and fairer or to revert back to previous eras of capitalism misunderstands its role in society. So long as the ruling class maintains its economic power, it will utilize the state to repress and hold back the oppressed classes. They must prevent us from rising up and challenging this system in any way they can. And we saw this very recently. Anytime the workers dare to fight back through strikes or demonstrations, and the most recent example is the Air Canada flight attendant strike. Some of you might have seen this, but when the Air Canada CEO was being interviewed on TV, he said, well, we thought obviously that Section 107 would be enforced. Basically, he's saying, we thought the government was going to do its job and send them the fuck back to work. This law has been enforced by the Liberals 8 times over the last 2 years. Why should he have expected any differently? And so ultimately, these laws and the system that upholds them are dependent on a struggle between the classes, between the workers and the capitalists for us. And I think the fight of the flight attendants showed the way forward. When they were forced back to work, they showed who really makes Air Canada run. And it ain't the CEO. The only way to make genuine improvements in our lives is to fight for them with courageous, militant class struggle tactics, like work stoppages, like the Air Canada strike, and generalizing them, bringing them to every worker, to every industry in society. And really, the need for class struggle is only becoming more necessary as time goes on. Since the end of the post-war boom, the capitalists have relentlessly attacked the working class. As the boom dried up and profit margins shrunk, they ruthlessly cut wages and attacked our living conditions to claw back what they had previously given. And they could not have done this alone. They relied on the government to do it for them. For decades, the norm has been to cut social services like healthcare and education, while corporations get tax cuts and bailouts. Every time there's a crisis, the corporations look to the state to save their skin. And ultimately, the state relies on the economic wealth of the capitalists, so they happily oblige in crisis after crisis. And really what we're seeing is that the profound contradictions of capitalism are revealed time and time again through each of these crises that we face. We, as the working class, create all wealth in society. Without our work extracting the oil, building the houses, stocking the shelves, nothing would get done. And this is why every effort is made by the capitalists to force us back to work or to hire scabs to take our place when we go on strike. Without the workers, no profits get made. And under capitalism, the means of production, the places that we go to work, all of the things that we need to create what we need to survive are owned privately by the bosses. And so this value we create is taken and they sell it off. And from all this wealth we create, we are paid back only crumbs in the form of our wage. And it's not just a problem of the workers not being paid enough, although I do want everyone to be paid better. In this system of production for profit, the working class as a whole can never afford to buy back all of the things that we produce. You can imagine that we bake the pie, but we are only given a small slice back. And what does this do? This creates excess commodities that the capitalists can't sell. And if these commodities aren't sold, the capitalists don't make their profits from them. And to survive, these excess commodities have to be sold off at any price to try and recover their money. And this is why corporations like H&M produce millions of clothing items each year, despite 1/3 of it never getting worn and then ending up in landfills in Chile and Southeast Asia. Yeah, it ends up in landfills across the globe. And so what we do is we produce far too much, and yet there are still people who go without. Why? Because giving these clothes and excess commodities to the people who actually need them is not profitable. This is the logic of capitalism. And so this production, this accumulation of commodities that can't be sold profitably, is called a crisis of overproduction, a crisis of too much. And when they can't sell these commodities, they're left to rot. It's like frozen money tied up in shelves and warehouses. And without money, they can't invest back into production. Production grinds to a halt. There are mass layoffs and factory closures until the crisis is dealt with, and we feel this most heavily. Yeah, I think that should be good. And so to overcome this crisis, the capitalists have three options. However, each one just kicks the can further down the road, preparing a bigger crisis. They can expand into new markets, for one. They can expand the credit system by diving deeper into debt through state spending and loans from the banks. Or they can squeeze more out of the working class by making us work for longer and work harder for less wages. Unfortunately for the capitalists of today, they have exhausted most of their options. On the first one, there are no consumers waiting in this uncharted part of the globe to buy Labubus and iPhones. The capitalists have already been attacking our living standards for decades, and every attack provokes social unrest among the workers. And before this, the capitalists have relied on going into debt to stabilize this system. And now we see that it's reaching the limits of credit with the massive debt crisis we're facing. Really, this is expressing the system reaching its limits. Worldwide debt is nearly equal to world GDP. What this means in simple terms is that every single worker on Earth would have to work for an entire year without getting paid to try and pay back all of this debt. It's impossible. And really, most of this debt was accumulated in just the last 30 years. First, during 2008, with the bank bailouts and the massive mortgage crisis, and then again during COVID. And this really exhausted the capitalist reserves. They don't have the money to do this, and it put them into this debt that we see today. And so when capitalism was still dragging society forward, hundreds of years ago, even 70, 80 years ago, this debt was able to kind of soothe its problems. But today, it only aggravates the disease. And so what this has done is placed the capitalists in a blind alley. Before, they could reinvest some of this surplus into production to grow the economy so they could pay back these debts eventually, right? And just kind of robbing Peter to pay the future Paul. But every new investment now only provokes further overproduction. The constant austerity and attacks on our living standards have driven down consumption, and so the only way left for them is to claw back the living standards of the workers, and claw back my banner, to claw back the living standards of the workers. And what this will do will ignite the dynamite lying within the foundations of capitalism. What we see is that world production has outgrown the limits of private property in these individual nation states. The system has reached its limits. The capitalists cannot develop society any further. And I think the most obvious example of this is in what's called falling labor productivity. If you read the news, they're talking about this a lot. They never really get it right. But labor productivity is essentially the amount of economic output per hour worked. And this has been the foundation of society. We have to work to keep ourselves alive, right? Whether it was with primitive tools and scavenging for food, to having to work our job at Starbucks or McDonald's to pay our student loans. But now, for the first time since the Great Depression, Canada's labor productivity began decreasing in 2024. What this means is that every hour of work in Canada now produces less value than it did a year ago. The capitalists can't reinvest back into production because it's less and less profitable. So they're hoarding this money or they use it to speculate. And so we're working harder than ever, but producing less wealth for us. And in Alberta, I think this is felt most heavily and obviously in the oil and gas industry. At the end of the last boom in 2014, the oil barons were pouring massive amounts of money into the province to the tune of $80 billion. Now it's just $30 billion. And this is despite the oil barons making record profits in the last 5 years. There has never been more oil wealth generated in Alberta, and yet none of this is resulting in better wages or jobs. All of this extra profit is going into stock buybacks and paying dividends. And similar stories are happening in most industries across the country and across the world. And so what we see is that in the hands of the billionaires, all the technology and industry and wealth of society are just a means to line the pockets of their friends, shareholders, and selves. And so this begs the question, what is the solution? And so as long as our labor continues to enrich the capitalists and not ourselves, their wealth will expand while we get poorer. And this is why the communists fight to end the capitalist system. As Marx explains, capitalism creates the conditions for its own destruction. Every measure they take to overcome the current crisis only kicks the can further down the road. This relentless drive for profit means production has grown enormously. There's more than enough wealth to meet everyone's needs. Total wealth in Canada is equal to $19.1 trillion. That's like 1/10 of a child in sales, if you were remembering from earlier, or about $460,000 per person. That's more than enough to guarantee a good standard of living. That pays for your tuition, a down payment on a pretty nice house, and a dignified life more than anything. But we have to take this wealth for ourselves. We already create it, but it is stolen, expropriated from us each hour and day. Under workers' control, the economy could be democratically planned on the basis of need, not profit. All of the existing monopolies, the commanding heights of the economy, must be nationalized without compensation and brought under public ownership to guarantee workers' control. In every workplace, rather than the management of the bosses who act as pit bulls for profit, managers would be elected through democratic vote with the right to recall. This would mean the workers having every right to choose the managers who are best for the job and to replace them when they fail. And with production under workers' control, the masses of people who are left unemployed and destitute could be brought into work to reduce the working day for all. Under capitalism, the bosses are constantly trying to lengthen the working day and squeeze us for maximum profits. By utilizing all the technology combined with the massive strength of the working class, the working week could be reduced down to 20 hours immediately. Every further advancement of technology and industry under workers' control would reduce it further. And after all, once enough clothing, food, and homes, and all the goods that we need and like are produced, there's no reason to keep all these factories running unless it is for profit. And with significantly more free time, the workers would be free to spend their lives pursuing education, culture, hobbies, and personal development. And along with this, the elected representatives of our workplaces would form workers' councils, where political debates and the direction of society could finally be determined by us, and not some guy in an office in Ottawa or at the legislature downtown. God, I hate that place. Excuse me. And so gone are the days of leaving every decision of our lives up to people in suits who see us as numbers on spreadsheets. And finally, an end could be put to this animal-like existence of humanity where we're forced to compete against each other for the scraps and crumbs that the capitalists leave us. The immense organization and planning that has been created by capitalism can be put under the collective ownership and conscious democratic control of the working class. But this transition will not happen automatically. As long as the capitalist system remains, the incredible potential of modern technology and planning will be squandered. Worse, it will be used as the destructive force that breeds the wars, climate catastrophe, and misery that pervades all of our lives. To seize this wealth, we need a socialist revolution. The masses of people who previously sat silent, leaving things to the politicians and businessmen, finally stand up. We take to the streets and make our voices heard. To do so, the working class must organize and mobilize. A revolution will come, and it will happen in Canada. We just don't know when it will happen yet, but it's coming. And so we'll see that only through class struggle, by using our collective power as the working class and shutting down production, can we end this system once and for all and finally make society for us. Thank you.